Spark is a tool for the formal verification of ADA programs, and it has two analyses, deductive verification and data information flow analysis. So deductive verification, we'll speak more about that. It's really on the formal side of the spectrum. So allegedly hard to use, and with potentially some assumption which makes it so that the strong guarantee that it gives may be moot in some cases. So we'll see how the two analyses that we have in Spark collaborate to try to improve on the state of the art for deductive verification. So first, a bit of background. The ADA language, I don't consider that you all know the ADA language. Do you all program in ADA? No, I'm not surprised. So ADA is a general purpose and imperative language, like C, and it's quite old. Like it's dating from 1983. This is still also like C, but unlike C, it is not very used. It was mostly used in automotive, in aircraft and in the military in the US. So there have been new versions of Spark, and in this case it's more like C++ because each version is growing, adding new features. You know how it is for C++. So it has low-level programming, but also other things like object-oriented programming, concurrency, this kind of things. One of the specificities of ADA with respect to C or C++ is that it was designed for safety, like Rust. But the way it's doing it is not exactly like Rust. Rust targeted a well-defined and small sense of safety, which is memory safety, and it's doing it entirely automatically and statically. And for ADA, it's different. It's targeting safety in a larger sense, and it is designing checks, which are supposed to ensure that nothing goes wrong in a larger sense. For example, we have a check when we divide, to division, to make sure that we don't divide by 0. We have a check when you access inside an array, to make sure that you don't access the array out of bounds. And these checks, they are sometimes done statically, when you are lucky, and everything is not at compile time. But otherwise, the compiler will generate some code that will be in new executable, and it will raise an exception in case of non-conformance. So arguably, this is better than just doing the bad behavior. It might depend on the context. So surely, if you are interested in security, it's better to throw an exception and stop the program than look into the buffer after the bound. But if you are inside an aircraft, maybe not. Then the other thing which makes ADA an interesting language for formal verification is that it allows to declare new types with additional constraints on the types. So here I have an example with the type of integer and a range. So this is nice for verification, of course, it's additional constraints, and they are associated to checks in the language. So if you put a value which is not in this bound, you will get an exception at one time. So going further, in the version of ADA from 2012, they have added proclamation by type. So contracts you already know, so I will do a small side here to show you the syntax of ADA rather. So we say that we had contract on subprogram. So what is a subprogram in ADA? The subprogram is either a function or a procedure. Because ADA makes a difference between functions which return something and procedure which don't return anything. And so you cannot discard the result of a function. Calling a function is an expression, and if you want an instruction, you need to call a procedure. Okay? This is a procedure. And so procedures usually work by side effect, since they do not return any result. And one way to use side effects is to modify your parameters. So this can be done in ADA by having different parameter modes. So by default, if you don't write anything, the parameter mode is in. You can write the parameter, you cannot write it. And the compiler will make sure that you don't write it. The mode can be in-out, like here, which means that you can write the initial value and you can update it. For the parameter to increment, it's a good idea. And the last possibility is to use out, which means that you are not supposed to read the initial value, but you will write something. And what is, I think, interesting is that the compiler can take advantage of that. In particular, in AIDA, its values can be, parameter passing can be either done by copy or by reference. For some types, like integers, it's specified, it's necessarily by copy, and for others, it's not specified. The compiler can do whatever it wants. Still, when the thing is passed by copy, then it needs to insert the copies when it's necessary, and when it's necessary, it depends on the parameter mode. For in or out, we need a copy at the beginning of the program, and for in, out, and out, we need a copy at the end. So be careful, do not read the out parameter, or you will get garbage, since there is no copy at the beginning. And also has, so here we use a contract with the pre and post conditions, so as usual, there are Boolean expressions which should be true at the beginning or at the end of the program. Here is a value reference to the value of an object at the beginning of the program in the post condition. This is why x equal and called an attribute. Then you can also use type invariance, and that define both strongs and type invariance. Some which need to always hold, and some which can be broken in some cases. And of course, since AIDA never calls things as everywhere else, strong type invariants are called subtype predicates. So here, this is a strong type invariant, and the sorted array object of the sorted array type need to be always. For these contracts, this is AIDA, they are not meant for formal verification. They can be evaluated at runtime. Or not, it depends on how you compile the program. And if they are evaluated and they fail, there will be a runtime exception. So of course, with all we have said so far, I think you can guess it, what we want to do with Spark. We would like to verify all these runtime checks statically. So the checks which are related by the language, divided by 0, or accessing inside an array. The checks which come from constraints in the types, ranges, stuff like that. And also contracts, which can be written by the user, when post condition and invariance. So let's look a bit at the Spark tool. So I have said that Spark performs deductive verification, which is very far on the formal method side, so very formal. And what we wanted to do is to make something which was usable by a developer as opposed to a professor. Okay, so that's not obvious. And I don't say that we manage it, but it's the ultimate goal. So verifications should be as easy as possible. So there are several things that we try to do to reach this goal, but here I have written two. The first one is that we want the verification to be as automated as possible. So the user still needs to write contracts, definitely, but otherwise we would like it to be automated. And the other thing is that formal verification is complicated, it's costly. People are probably not going to verify their whole program. So we want it to be easy to mix the verification done by Spark with other verifications, particular testing, since it is the one which is mostly used. But really, testing here just means executing the program, so it could be fuzzy. So Spark is not a new idea. It's a language which has been industrially used for years, but still it's not widely used. And it is open source, I will give you the GitHub link at the end. So what does it do? It performs deductive verification. I have told you already. You all know what deductive verification is? Who knows what deductive verification is? Nobody? Okay, I will explain. Then deductive verification, it takes some code, so here's some IDA code, with some contracts which have been added manually, and it transforms that into a set of logical formula, which we call verification conditions, using, in general, recursive precondition calculus. What is important is that it is automated. And then all these verification conditions, they are given to solvers, which are supposed to verify them. So in general, in Spark, we use automatic solvers because we want it to be automated, but we could use a proof assistant like Coq. In general, we use SMT solvers. And if all the verification conditions are verified, it means that the program and the contract are correct. Which is why I say that we are far on the formal method side. We are on the side where we try to prove that there is no error as opposed to detect bugs. Okay? And this means that Spark is soundy. So modulo the potential assumptions, if you have verified your program, there should not be any bug anymore. Of course, it's not complete, which means that it doesn't mean that you have a bug if you cannot verify the program. In particular, you may be missing some contracts because predictive verification, it works modularly on a per-program basis. It will analyze each program function, as I said, separately, and it will use the contracts to summarize the rest of the program when verifying this small part. So, for example, when you want to verify your program, your subprogram, you will use the precondition to summarize all the potential polling contexts. So you will use verification of the program and the post-condition in the context of the precondition. So here it is why we can prove that there is no overflow check when incrementing X, because we have the precondition. And then when we call the subprogram, we will of course check the precondition to make sure that the calling context is expected. And then we will not look inside the body of the subprogram that we call, since we say it's modular. We will use the post-condition to summarize what was done by the program. So here, for example, I have X which is 0, and then I can increment on it. Here I want to prove the precondition, of course, and it's provable because 0 is not the last integer, so that's fine. Then I can increment again, and here it's not provable because, in fact, I cannot look at the body, so I don't know that X at this point is 1. I can only look at the post-condition, and the post-condition is not precise. It says that X has been increased, but we don't know by how many, so here the program cannot be verified, but of course it's not wrong. So you are in a case where we are incomplete. And we also see that it is a reason why the user has to write contracts. Otherwise, they will not be able to use the tool to do verification. And not only contracts, good contracts too. If they are imprecise, it doesn't work anymore. So, now with respect to other deductive verification tools, you might know some. One difference of Spark with respect to most deductive verification tools is that because it is AIDA and the contracts are part of the language, we are not allowed to use any semantic we want for the things which are in the contract. It's a semantic of AIDA. They are AIDA expressions. This has some advantages, and we put them forward when we try to sell the tool. So some more convincing than others. The first one is that you don't need to learn another language, provided you know how an AIDA expression is evaluated. Then it's the same for the contract. The other two are more interesting, I think. The first one is that you can debug the contract because they can be executed, and you can test them. You can run the debugger to find where is the problem. Say you have a crash somewhere. And here, as we do verification, we know that it is very important to be able to debug the specifications of the contracts. So this is something which is nice, especially when the contracts grow bigger. You run more risk of having issues with them. And the other thing which is nice is that it makes it easier to mix with other kinds of verifications, in particular verifications which execute the program. Because we have the same semantic between the contracts for the verification and the contract for the execution. So that's easier. But of course, that's drawbacks, obviously, otherwise everybody would do that. There are no, in particular, the semantics of AIDA, so there will be error at runtime in the contract. For example, overflows. So here I have modified the precondition of increment to say that the X plus 1 should be less than the last integer. Obviously, it's the same mathematically than the previous one, but this one is not correct. Because when you give the forbidden value, which is the last integer, then you will get an overflow instead of having the precondition evaluated to false. It's not working. The other problem, I will not extend on that, but is that contracts are mainly restricted to executable features. So when you want to do quantification, you are restricted. Basically, you can do quantification on ranges and contents of containers. It's not as constraining as you might think, but still, it can be painful sometimes.
Just Claire, is the condition really necessary since you already specify that X is an integer? So since it is an integer, it can't even be larger than the
X plus 1, not X.
Yeah.
So that's, because I want to increment it, I want it to be 1 less. So that's what yeah. But this one is still, what you say is good because this one is an entire integer too. So in fact, this precondition evaluates always true, but in addition, you can have a runtime exception. So no, it's useless, and you should definitely not write that. The previous one was useful though. So going further in this on this thought, since contracts contain regular ADA expressions, the functions that you call contracts, they are regular ADA functions. They may have a contract, a precondition, so they are partial functions, and it's possible that they might not terminate on all input if they have a loop or something inside. Of course, this contract that we translate into the interleaving logic, we can use in them functions. The functions which are used in contract, those are mathematical functions. Total, of course. And they don't have a contract. So what can you do if you have a contract and you want to go to something which is a mathematical function? You can use Axiom to give you a contract. This is theoretically simple. You say for all input, it satisfies the precondition, then the result of the function satisfies the postcondition. Easy, right? Except that it might happen that the contract on the function, I say infeasible, if we had to relate to the last talk of yesterday, it would be more like unrealizable. Okay, that's the same idea. Here, my example says that I have a function which takes an integer and returns boolean, it has no precondition, which means it's always fine to call it, and then there's a post condition which is false. So in fact, here, we don't have any way to implement this function, and its contract would lead to an incorrect axiom, an unsound axiom, which would say for x, true implies false, which is kind of bad. So here, the tool needs to be extra careful with that, and we will come back to that multiple times later during the talk. Still, in Spark, we allow most ADA functions to be called inside contracts. So we have spoken a lot about DHT verification. What about the other analysis, which is data and information flow? So this one is far simpler. It will just use the control flow graph basically, and at each node of the control flow graph, we will consider which values are read, which values are written, and this enables to create a graph of dependencies or flow of information between the various objects. So, okay, this is lightweight compared to the DHT verification, surely. In general, requires no contracts. It can be imprecise because it only tracks the flow of information between variables, not the values. So it's not value dependent. But still, we see that in Spark, we rely a lot on this analysis for soundness, precision, and even for efficiency. Okay, so now in this talk, I will first explain how in Spark the work is divided between flow analysis and proof, who does what. The aim is to use each tool as their strength, as much as possible. And so this was the historical division. And then afterward, along the year, mostly because of bigger user complaints, we have tried to make the two analyses collaborate. And that's what we are going to see afterward. we see how flow analysis helps deductive verification by computing additional information when it turns, and then how proof can help flow analysis by taking care of parts which require precision, because flow analysis is imprecise. And finally, we look at a particular feature, initialization, where we have made the choice to let the user choose whether they want to use proof or flow to do the check. So, first, who does what? So, flow analysis. What does it do? It verifies what we call flow contracts. So, flow contracts are used to say which are the global variables accessed by a program, take the flow dependency between variables, and termination. So, we show you syntax briefly because it's a nice branch. So this is a global contract. It lists all the global variables which are accessed. So here at B, G, it accesses the two global variables, V and G, and it takes G and it increases by the value of V. And so it has two global variables, V and G, and then we associate a mode, like for parameters, to them. So input means that V is read, not written, and in-out means that G is both read and written in the program, basically. And we also have a mode output, of course, like the out mode of parameters. So this is for the global contract. The one below is the depends contract. It's for dependency between inputs and outputs. So here, for each output, we will list all the dependency on the other side of the arrow. So here we only have one output, G. And so we said here that the final value of G, which is an output, depends on the initial value of G and V. Okay? This kind of contract is especially useful when you are doing security. And finally, this one is easy. It says that the program terminates. Always. So flow analysis will take care of this verification because in general they are not value dependent, or not too much.
Is it exact dependencies or is it some main? Does it mean that G must depend on G on V or may depend on G on V?
It's may, and flow analysis may write warnings if you don't do what you are supposed to. So if you are not precise enough, it might raise warnings to tell you that you could have more precise contract. But maybe you don't want a more precise contract, and that's fine. Okay, but it doesn't only check these contracts for analysis. It also checks simplifying assumptions. So what are simplifying assumptions? Well, obviously there are assumptions which are meant to simplify the problem. So data is complex. If we want to verify it efficiently, we need to have assumptions. There are two goals, these assumptions. One, I think is obvious, is so that the tool is more efficient. And the other one, which is maybe less obvious, is that we want it to be as easy as possible for the user to annotate the program. Because we have said that, unfortunately, the user needs to add possibly a lot of notations to verify the program. So if they need to add less, all the better. Okay, so those are the two goals of these simplifying assumptions. And of course, designing a simplifying assumption is something which is complicated, because it is a trade-off. You need to choose between the expressivity of the language and the usability of the tool. And since we want Spark to be as sound as possible, we want this simplifying assumption to be checked. And flow analysis does that. So, what kind of simplifying assumption do we have? Let's look at it. The first one says that we don't want side effect in expressions. This is mostly due to the fact that expressions are used in contracts, and side effects in contracts are generally not a good idea. So this means that regular functions, at least the one which can be called in contracts, those cannot have side effects. But of course, procedures can have side effects. The second one is more interesting. In Spark, we don't want aliasing of variables. So basically, this says that if in your program you have a name and you modify it, it cannot affect any other name you have in your program. Okay? So this is an interesting simplifying assumption because it fills the usual goal of simplifying assumptions. It makes it easier for the tool to do its job because it's easier to know for each instruction which variables are modified by the instruction. And it also makes it easier for the user to annotate the program because I don't need to specify which of the values I use are potentially aliased with each other. However, of course, it's a simplifying assumption, so it's a trade-off. It means that we have to restrict the language. And in particular, when we use pointer, it's easy to introduce aliasing, because each time you copy a pointer, you create an alias. So we had to introduce an ownership policy in Spark, which is not in Ada, but it's in Spark by price with a board checker to make sure that it's fine. And finally, the last one is for the validity of variables. We want everything to be initialized before it's tried. And this, we'll go a bit more into the detail because initialization, we'll talk about it again later. So this is done by using an initialization policy. So the aim of this initialization policy is to be as easy to check as possible and to not require additional contracts, like usual for simplifying assumptions. So what we say is that before a call, all inputs to be entirely initialized, and after the call, all outputs to be entirely initialized. Okay. So I have an example here, a procedure P with two parameters, x, which doesn't have nodes, so it's an input, and psi, which is an output. Inside P, I will write the value of x, which is fine, because as per the initialization policy, it has to be initialized, entirely initialized at this point. And then I require psi, but not on all cases. You can see that here, since we have the if branch and the else if branch, the missing x branch, well, it's not written. So if x is 0, here, the sign will not be initialized. So for analysis, we'll complain here. Does not that if I change the program so that 0 falls into one of the two branches, then we will still have a complaint because flow analysis is not value dependent. So it's not able to see that the L branch is not accessible if it's not accessible. So we have seen that flow analysis does a lot of work. And after that, it checks all the simplifying assumptions and the contracts for flow. Then proof can do the rest of the work, which is value dependent. If we check what we wanted to check at the beginning, so that there are no runtime errors in the program, and that's the contracts, pre and post condition, and invariance. Okay? This is how it was designed at the beginning. Now, along the year, we have tried to make this, the collaboration between the tool more involved. And the first axis of collaboration is to use flow, which ranks first, to compute additional information for proof. So, we have seen that we can write global contracts on the programs. If you recall, they are used to state which global variables are modified by your subprogram. But users, they don't want to write them. And so for two reasons. The first one is that they tend to grow. If you have a big call graph, at the top of the call graph, you need to speak about all the global variables called by all the things that you call. So this is painful. And the other reason is that they don't care. They want to verify their program to ensure that there are no runtime errors. They don't care about global variables. So it would be nice if you want to make the tool usable for the user to be allowed to not put the global contract. Yes, but of course we need them for proof. And here I have an example where I have my procedure at 2v, add g from before, plus function readg. I won't say what's doing. What is important is that it is reading g, so that the result is dependent on the value. And then here I have a call to add g, and I need to be precise to know that, for example, add g has not updated e. I need that to be precise. And more than that, I need to be sound to know that add g has modified g, and that the function read g, so that I know that the value returned by the function might have changed. So here I really need termination. So what we do, of course, to analysis runs first, and it can compute another approximation of the global contract if the user are not supplied. For termination, it is kind of similar. It's similar because the user don't want to write the terminating annotation. They don't care in general if things terminate. The thing which is different is that in general, the duty verification doesn't care about termination either, because we do partial correctness. So we only want to verify the post condition if the subprogram terminates. So it should be fine, right? But in fact, no, because when you have something which doesn't terminate, it can lead to infeasibility, or, like we have said before, unreliability. So here I have my infeasible function from before, and I have put a body on it, and inside I call something which doesn't terminate. Since I am doing partial correctness, it means that I can prove the post condition. It only needs to be valid if the thing terminates, it doesn't, so it's fine. And of course, here this is bad, right? Because then, if I am not careful, I will not be able, I will write an axiom for that, if it is using a contract, and then I will prove something which is false. So that's not good. So, here again, flow analysis saves us, because it can infer this always terminates contracts if they are not supplied by the user, and then it can use it to check that we never call in contracts functions which we don't know that we don't know that they terminate. Okay? So similar. So here we have seen how flow analysis can help by computing contracts that the user do not want to write, but there are other things that we need to know in proof for soundness, and which cannot be annotated inside contracts. At least as of now. It's the case for recursive or mutually recursive subprograms. AIDA doesn't identify recursive or mutually subprograms, not like Camel, for example. And even, it's possible to have recursion, mutual recursion, across different compilation units. So not so nice, because you don't even see the body of everyone when you're trying to do the analysis. But still, we need to know that things are recursive. So if you have a dot, let's look at the example I have written, it's still infeasible. So the same false post condition, but I have added another post condition which has a recursive call inside. So it's not very important what it does. Basically, well, it says that we always return true, right? Or it doesn't say anything even. Okay. So the importance is that we have this call inside the contract. Since we have this call here, we might want to be able to verify this post condition to use the axiom, the recursive axiom, on infeasible. Okay? If we were to do that, and to introduce this axiom to do the verification, the axiom is unsound, we could use it to prove false. And this would be incorrect. Okay? And it is even the case, even if here, infeasible is returning, it's terminating. Since it's doing the recursive call on something which is small. Okay? So here again, we need additional information from flow analysis to tell us that in fact infeasible is recursive, and we should not use an axiom for this contract, even if it is called in the post condition, because it's dangerous.
So you are not able to have proofs?
Yes, we can, but you won't see the contract of this call. If you have a similar call inside the body of infeasible, which in general is the case, then it's fine. You will see this particular occurrence of the contract. Okay? That's just for the call inside the contract. But yes, you can very well use the recursive function. In practice, it works fine, unless you are trying to do very strange things. And you can even go further. More generally, when you do modular proof, it's possible that the proof of two subprograms are interdependent, are cyclic, even if they are not mutually recursive. So this can happen because they are using another entity, so a constant or a type, which contains the call. So I have written an example here with the if natural function, which is manually feasible, right? And I have a subtype, my natural, and it's in the predicate, so the invariant. I call this function. This can be kind of funny, and then it's getting even worse because inside the function is natural, I can reject of this type. This is not strictly speaking recursive because is natural doesn't contain a call to the is natural function, especially not if you don't compile with assertions. But still, here we have a proof dependency, and we need to be able to detect that. Otherwise, we would be unsound. So this is getting a bit complex maybe, but flow analysis is computing a lot of information that we need for proof to be able to, remove, first make the tool more usable by allowing the user to not write all the contracts, and then make the tool soundier, less unsound, by discarding some additional assumptions that we could have. Now let's look at the other way around. How do we use proof to help flow analysis? So let's get back to our example from before. You recall it with P with two parameter x, which is input, and sign, which is output. And here I have just shown something, and I put a precondition to remove the zero value. So that now the check that sign is entirely initialized, which is failing for flow analysis, become a false negative. It become incorrect. So here we would like to help flow analysis with this verification because here this pass is dead. So what we can do is we can say that the pass is dead, and one way to say that is to put the pragma assert false inside the else branch. If we do that, flow analysis will recognize the pragma assert false. It's not value dependent, so it's not doing anything smart, just pragma assert false exactly, syntactically. And then we say, well, this branch is dead, so I will cut it. I do not consider that it flows to the end of the program, and I don't need to initialize sign in this branch. Remark that it would not be correct to cut the branch and remove it from the control flow graph entirely. I don't know if you see why, but in this branch here I have nothing. But I could have some things in here and some flow checks, like for initialization, for example. And maybe the proof of pass or false depends on some of those flow checks. So I cannot just remove the branch, right? I still need to do the flow checks inside, but it just doesn't flow to the indices. Pragma assert false is not the only way a user might want to signal that a program, that a pass in a program doesn't reach the end of the program, that it's dead. Another way to do so is to raise an exception. So in general, Spark supports both raising, handling, and propagating exceptions, but it requires subprograms which can propagate exceptions to be annotated, saying that they can propagate exceptions. So here we have the specific basis contract, which lists the exceptions which can be raised and under which conditions they can be raised. And it's even possible to do that in an imprecise way. One just says that it might raise any exception in any condition. Okay? Then, thanks to this annotation, it's possible, easily, without anything value dependent, to know when an exception is raised and when it is not expected. It is not expected, it means that it cannot be handled and it cannot be propagated. Okay? Since we are able to decide that, these exceptions, which are unexpected, they can be seen as something which is cutting the branch is dead. So flow analysis will just cut the branch, and proof will check, of course, that its exception is never raised. So in particular, it allows us to handle defensive coding, that is one, where we raise an exception for a value which is not supposed to appear, because it's the same program as before, and we don't want zero, it's not allowed by the precondition. Okay? Okay, another case where we can help proof is for termination. When there is a loop, It's necessary for flow analysis to make sure that the loop terminates, to be able to prove that the function terminates. For loops, it's fine, because in Ada, it's not like in C, for loops they always terminate. But if you have another loop, for example a while loop, then you need to check that it terminates by other means. And in general, in deductive verification, it is done by using a variant. In general, what is a variant? It's an integer value which decreases while staying positive. Since you cannot decrease forever while staying positive, of course it terminates. And in Spark, we also allow matching integers, which either always increase or always decrease, since matching integers they are bounded and the same. Of course, flow analysis cannot check variance, that's value dependent. So when they see a variant, they will just consider the loop terminates, and the check will be automatically deferred. And it's the same for conditional termination. We have seen already this always terminates a contract. But in fact, we can add a condition, by default is true. It means that the program always terminates. And, but it can be something else. And the condition says in which condition the program is supposed to terminate. Of course, these conditions, when they are static, they are value dependent, so flow analysis cannot handle them. So when they see a call to a program with a conditional termination, they will look for proof. And the same if we are trying to verify the program with a conditional termination, they will just use the verification. Okay? So, until now, we have seen cases where automatically flow analysis detects that something will be value dependent, too hard for it, so it will just leave it and proof will take care of it later. Okay? Here we'll see a case where this is not done automatically. The user has to choose. So initialization. I told you before, this is generally in Spark checked by flow analysis using an initialization policy which says that for the program, all input should be entirely initialized before the call, all output should be entirely initialized after the call. But of course, this has limitations. Since it is a simplifying assumption, that's expected. In particular, when you are trying to initialize something, the fact that it is initialized can be value dependent. In particular, it happens a lot for arrays. Here we have an array, and I initialize it by parts with 3 slices. I first put the beginning of A, then B, then the end of A. And of course, it is entirely initialized. You can see it. But for flow analysis, that's not possible, because the bound of the slides are value dependent, and it cannot decide that the array is entirely initialized at this point. Another case, which can be problematic, is when the initialization policy is too constraining. So here I have made an example with a record E, with record R, which has 2 fields, F1 and F2. And I want to do functions which initialize separately these fields. And since they are only initializing one field of the X parameter, I can use out as a mode for the parameter, as otherwise I need to initialize everything. It's entirely initialized, so I have to put in Okay? But then I want to do X, which initializes everything here. And here I want to put the mode out. But if I try to call either of these functions then on X, it will not work because since X has not been out here, it needs to be entirely initialized before I call the init F1 procedure, which kind of defeats the purpose. So, well, these examples have been things which we have seen from customers along the years, and of course we have workarounds. We tell them initialize the array completely at declaration. For example, we tell them each time you can justify the check by value, you know, they don't like that very much. So we had to do something to improve. And something we could do is to use proof to check initialization. And it would work. It would work because it is value dependent. So when you initialize your array by parts, it's able to decide that the array is entirely initialized. It would also work because Since proof is value dependent again, it can look into the contracts. So we can use the contracts to state precisely which parts of the object are initialized if we want to relax the initialization policy, which was too constraining for one example. So here we see that we have done that by using this effect initialized. So here we say that input y has to be entirely initialized, but obviously in text. And in the post condition, we say that we are initialized only the F1 field of x and not the F2 field which is left as it was. Okay? So this would be nice, right? To solve nicely the problem. However, as you might expect, these are drawbacks. But the principle of simplifying a solution. The two drawbacks you would expect. If we make writing the annotations more complicated, it will make the tool less efficient, as always. So you need, if you want to use proof to verify initialization, to write contract for initialization everywhere. And here I've done it for increments. You see that the contracts are not very interesting, they are kind of obvious, and we double the max. So that's not very good, right? And even more than that, you might require additional annotation to put them afterward, like, I don't know, invariance, not so appealing. And the other problem is that proof of other things, other unrelated things, might become less efficient. Because the tool will have to consider that part of the object might be uninitialized, and this will increase the search space. And we all know that if you increase the search space, you become less efficient. So, we decided to let the user choose. Either it's the most natural case, they want to use flow analysis and the initialization policy. They don't have to do anything, they don't have to write contract, it all works nicely. And then if in some cases it's not working, they can use an annotation which we call relax initialization, which says that they want to use proof and relax the initialization policy. Okay? Both at once, not two annotations. So for example, what's next is that I can use it on it's not just a global switch. It's for each object I can choose whether I want to use proof or to use flow. So for example here I can annotate trace with relax initialization, and then the proof that trace is initialized will go through without any additional ask. So this is nice. I can also annotate this way parameters and function results. So here, for example, I have annotated the x parameter of the procedure unit F1 to say that its initialization is relaxed, but only x, which means that I don't need to have a precondition to say that y is initialized. It's still subjected to the initialization policy, so we know that it is initialized before the call to unit F1. But I can use the precise post condition that I wanted to use before, saying that I only initialize the F1 field of X. We can also annotate types with relax initialization. So why would we want to annotate types? In general, is to create partially relaxed structures. A good example is a stack. You create a stack, so in the stack you have an array of a fixed length for the content of the stack, and then you have an index which grows when you add elements. And so this is a natural implementation of stack. In this case, we know by the API of the stack that we are never going to access elements past the top pointer. So our user, what they want to do is to not initialize the elements of the array when they create it, right? Because it can be expensive. So what I can do is to annotate the type of the array with relax initialization. So here, my stack type has mixed initialization. This one is done by proof, this one is not annotated, it's done by flow. And then, since proof is doing the initialization of content and proof is value dependent, I can use a type invariant, a strong type invariant, to say that the beginning of my stack, the elements are all initialized, which is nice. Okay, we still have some time? Not a lot? Yeah. Okay. So do you want to see a bit how it works? Yeah. So since we want to be able to reason about the initialization of each part of the data structure independently, we need a Boolean flag per component, basically, for the verification. Then, when we want to check that something is initialized, we need to check all the flags of the components. So here, for example, if I have a Y object of type R, I can initialize first the F1 field and then the F2 field, and as per the contract, I know that both Boolean flags are true, and at the end, I can prove that Y is entirely initialized. Of course, I also need to go in flow analysis and to disable the checking on these objects, and to be sure that we don't do any mistake and forget an object which will be checked neither by flow nor by proof, we use the same routine in flow and proof to decide which pairs will check which objects. And finally, since flow analysis is not able to handle this dynamically partially initialized object, when we take an object like Y, which is handled by proof, and we compile it with an object which is handled by flow, we need to check that it is entirely initialized. For partially relaxed structures, it's basically the same. So you will have a Boolean flag per component, which are relaxed, of course. What is less obvious is that when you are reading such an object, you don't need to check the flags of the parts which are relaxed initialized. Why? We have our example of stack, and then we initialize object of type stack, and here top is initialized, right, to 0, and the content is not. And then when I call push, I will read X, but I don't want to check that content is initialized. It's fine because since the fact that it is partially initialized is encoded in the type, then push, we know that the content of X might not be initialized, and we will answer the checks at this point. Okay? So neither flow nor proof checks initialization of this stuff when they are read. But the whole object is read, obviously, if you read the field, and here we need to check it. And of course, if I put relax initialization of an object of type stack, and I call tick initialize on this object, I will not consider the flag of content. Finally, before I finish, I just wanted to speak with you about interaction of these features with other features, because you know the devil is always in the details. And I have two features that I wanted to talk about, and the first one is strong type invariance. So, subtype predicates. When you use relax initialization on something, you expect to be able then to initialize it by part, to leave it partially initialized. If your object here has a type which has a predicate, then it's not the case. Why? Because it's a strong predicate, it needs to always hold. And for us to be able to check it, we need the object to be entirely initialized, so it can defeat the purpose, right? So here, for example, I have my type R with two fields F1 and F2, and predicate, and then when I find the object is initialized, but as soon as I write something in it, I need to check the predicate, and for that, I will require that the object is entirely initialized. However, I can put the predicate on the type, which itself is a relaxed initialization. If I do that, then it becomes fine because the predicate is on the type which has initialization, so it will expect the object to be partially initialized. So again, I can initialize it by part because I don't need the object to be entirely initialized to check the predicate. So this is kind of funny. And I won't speak about types which inherit from each other, predicates which are defined on something which is relaxed and something which is not relaxed. That's not. The other feature I wanted to mention is flow dependencies. We have seen them at the beginning, this depends contract. I don't know if you recall. For each output of the program, it lists all the inputs which on which the output value depends. And this contract, whether something appears on the right or on the left of the arrow, whether they are an input or an output, it depends on the mode of the parameter or the global variable. For example, here, in G, it has G as an output parameter, and it has X as an in parameter. So it means that I can only write the contract that way. So I could say that G depends on nothing, right? But otherwise, G must necessarily depend on X and not on G, right? Because G is enough. Okay. And this was all fine when we had the initialization policy. Because at the end of any G, I would check that G is entirely initialized, and since I am only allowed to read X inside the program, then it means that it cannot depend on anything else, right? So it's fine. G depends on X. But now, if G has class initialization, then I am allowed to only partially initialize it inside any G. And here, I have only functions that have one field, so the F2 field, it can depend on anything. And this is not good, because it can break other checks for flow dependency later. So what we do is that we consider that when we call a subprogram like this one, that all its out parameters and the globals of mode output are uninitialized by the code. Not the case, but it makes sure that proof will verify that we never read the parts which are not accounted for in the dependence contracts. Okay? So we are plugging the holes. Okay, so this is one last slide. I can skip it if I don't have time. But the idea is just that in ADA, some objects are always initialized. It's the case of pointers. It's to avoid dominant pointers. So the objects are always entirely initialized. So you might think that it's not necessary to add a Boolean flag for them, since they are always initialized. In fact, it's not the case because of the dependence contract. So here I have a small example where I have two out parameters. So I can not depend on each other, but B is Boolean and H is an holder, and inside there is an access. So when inside the body of the set, I don't want to be able to check whether the pointer is null to write in B, because otherwise I have an unaccounted for dependency. Okay, so I need a flag, even for things which are always initialized. Yeah, pointers. So, to conclude, Spark mostly does deductive verification, so it's something which is very formal, with the strengths and weaknesses of things which are very formal. So it's not that easy to use, and it has some assumptions for some less. And so we try by adding another analysis in the Spark tool to alleviate some of these limitations by using the strengths of the other tool. So here we use deductive verification for everything which is precise, everything we wanted to check, and then we use analysis to check some of the things we want to check which are not value dependent, and in particular to check simplifying assumptions to make it to make the tool more. So this was the design initially, and then going further along the years, because users have been asking for it, we have made it so the two analyses collaborate more. So we use flow analysis to compute additional information for proof that is useful to avoid some assumptions, and we use proof to make flow analysis more precise in the cases where more precision is required. And finally, we have decided for initialization to create a feature which allows the user to choose which analysis they want to use to verify initialization of their objects. So as future work, we could go even further away. For example, we have checks for non-aliasing, I told you. So here swap has two parameters of mode in-out. They should not alias when they are called. And then in swap array element, they call it button elements of an array. And the problem is to know that two elements of an array are different. It's value dependent, because I need to know that the indexes are different. So flow analysis is not good at that, and we could defer to check to proof. Or we could imagine deferring some checks of more checking to proof, but I don't think we want to go this way. And here are all the links you might want if you are interested by Spark. In particular, the GitHub. Also, if you want to try it, you don't need to build it yourself, which is kind of nice. It's a part of Alive, which is a package manager for IDA. If you want to use it.
Thank you very much.